This conference will now be recorded.
Thank you, Graham. All yours.
It says that you need to make me the presenter.
Oh, yes. Just a minute. I'll make you the organizer. So,
I have.
full controls. Yep.
All right. So you should see my PowerPoint.
Yes, we can.
And it even came up on the right screen. All right. So thanks everybody for joining the Connectathon. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me to be here. As I said, I had really hoped to actually be here, but that just wasn't going to be. And so Kimmer asked me to talk about moving FHIR forward in India. So talk a little bit about Wi-Fi, a little bit about some of the underlying challenges we're dealing with, and then how I think things move forward based on experience in other countries. But I wanted to start with this diagram here, which is always very popular with my audiences. It's a measure of the hit counts on the main public servers over the last year. Actually, it's a few months old now, but you can see the 4 or 5 big sources of hits in the world. I mean, some of this stuff, like I showed this diagram in Russia, and they're like, "What's that here? There's nothing with this status. It just there's nothing there." And of course, it always prompts a big argument. Like I showed it in South America, and they had a big argument about Argentina versus Brazil and Chile, and so forth. But from the very beginning, we've got all these hits from India here. Of course, most of that is actually American corporates doing their thing, just outsource to India. But there's a lot of engineers doing FHIR in India. Just not so much use of it in India. And that's consistently been the case. So I'm kind of encouraged because you've got a lot of people who know how things work in India. All right. So quick introduction to FHIR. I created FHIR. It was my fault. What happened? It was my fault. I came to a crisis, and the crisis was prompted by a few different things, but one of those was some health events in my own family. And I'm looking at the healthcare system going, it's broken. The processes are broken. And of course, I often, I speak around the world and I often have clinical, healthcare providers get a bit upset about that statement. But the fundamental problem is that everyone is doing their part at world class as best as they can, and they put a lot of passion into that, and I don't question that. And that's my own experience too. But everybody's accountable for the different parts. There's no matching overall accountability. There's no, and the experience of a patient is not by part. It's the experience of a patient is with their healthcare. And partly the reason that it's broken up by parts is because healthcare doesn't have good support from IT. And we've seen IT enable process transformation in other industries. It's starting to happen in healthcare. It wasn't back in 2011. And look, I've worked in healthcare all my life, and I know change is hard, and it's only partly because of IT. In fact, we could fix IT and nothing would change. But unless we fix IT, nothing will change. So there was that side of things. And then I was in HL7, and I was, pretty deeply involved in HL7, but it was clear that the things that HL7 were doing were not fit for the web age, not fit for the way things are going to be. Back in 2011, you could see that it was absolutely this immense wave of IT coming, and the standards weren't ready. There were no other organizations in a position to fill the bridge, the gap. the standards, you know, I could criticize inherent the standards, but the key was that HL7 had no overall picture that was ready for the need. And HL7 had really come to understand that, and it was trying to figure out how to make what it had go forwards. And I said, no, we're going to start again. We're going to start with something in a new direction. It'll be based on the web. It'll have an open license, as simple as possible. We're going to be pragmatic. We won't based on any particular design dogma. We want it to be cheap to implement. We want it to have a really solid framework that works for localization and extensibility, because my experience around the world is that's critical. And I wanted the one framework to be suitable for business to business integration and consumer to business, because it was clear that consumer to business is going to be the thing. So I sat down and I said, those are the things that we want. How would we get them? And then that's how we ended up with FHIR. But really what FHIR is it's the web for healthcare. And on the one, most people who think about FHIR are focused on the technical specification, but I think about it as two parts. A community. It's an open community that makes it easier. Our goal is to make it easier to exchange healthcare information. We're based on open participation. Anybody in the world, every one of you, can be part of what we're doing. You don't need to cross any gate. You don't need to cross any bridge. You don't need to spend any money. You just need to be part of it. But of course, the deeper you get involved, the more it costs, and the more you benefit. But anybody, it's open to participate. And it's led by HL7, which means we're deeply connected to the world of healthcare, all around the world, all the parts of it. And then what happens is the community talks about what do we need to do to exchange healthcare information? What exchanges do we need? How do we fix healthcare? And then we argue about how we're going to do it. Really, that's what we do. We argue, and eventually we come to a compromise that's kind of makes everybody somewhat happy. And we write that down and we call that the standard. And so what we produce as a community, we produce a standard. The standard describes how to exchange healthcare information wherever possible. We use the web APIs, web technology, web standards, and we have very deep continuity with existing healthcare standards. And that's really important if you're going to bring your own existing records forward. You know, almost anybody can figure out how to fix healthcare if you just start again, but nobody wants to start again, and we shouldn't. And so a big part of what we do is continuity with existing records. And then we produce public treasure, which I'll come back to. But it's open, it's an open source standard. And that sort of in a nutshell is what we're doing with FHIR. Oops, wrong focus. And I took that idea and an example of what it could look like, and a small passionate community grew around the idea. We built specifications and tools and demonstrations and a web presence. People started taking those into production because they liked what we had. We grew and matured and we became stable. And then we were chosen by a bunch of US EHR vendors, which I'll come back to and talk about later, for their main interoperability push. Then Apple Computing chose FHIR for its health, the basis of its health kit for health care, as opposed to the wellness fitness stuff they do. Those were really, really big deals for our community. And of course, there's users all over the world. And I think this slide I did for England, so I picked out English NHS. And then we had more pilots and more success, and we grew the community and meetings and social media and, well, teleconferences and all different forums. And it's really it's a sequence of building and building and building. And really, it's not because we're particularly clever. We're passionate. That's what we are. We're passionate, but I don't think we're particularly clever. we're building on the web API where you have a capability-based approach, search is ubiquitous. We build on stable identifiers, and that's a struggle for a lot of implementers, is finding and producing stable identifiers. It sort of reaches into everything you're doing and you chase this string to get stable identifiers. But the web framework has got a deep, well-supported stack on all technologies. There's a massive community knows how to do web development. Although FHIR is more than a web API because it's a healthcare standard, but principally it's a web API. And as I said, we focus on implementers. It's not just programmers or developers, it's people who want to make it work. We produce multiple reference implementations, which some of you will use. We have publicly available test servers, which I know a lot of people use. We hold Connectathons. Hey, we're doing one here. Great. And there's all these example instances. And really, the standard is no good. It doesn't matter how perfect the standard is. The only proof of how good it is that people actually use it and that people can depend on it and make it work. And a big part of that is making it free. And so it's always available at hl7.org/FHIR. It's licensed under Creative Commons public domain, which is the most open of licenses. HL7 has no restrictions in any way. You can do whatever you want with the standard, and no one can have any ownership of rights to do with the FHIR content because HL7 waived its rights so that you can do whatever you want with the standard without needing to worry about legal ramifications. Although HL7 protects the trademark, that is a FHIR trademark. So if you are writing a library that you're going to publish or a product you're going to sell and using FHIR inside the product, like it's a library name or a product URL or whatever, you're not talking about FHIR that HL7 published, you're just applying FHIR to something you did, then you need written permission to do that. We'll give you written permission. We want you to do that, but we have to protect the trademark. So just search for FHIR trademark and then apply for written permission and you'll get it. But that's just an aside. The key is whatever you want to do with the standard itself and all of the generated material you can generate code from or whatever, you can do that. We started working in 2011 and we've been pushing milestones out since 2014. And release 4, which is the current release, which we pushed out at the end of 2019, is the focus, everybody's focus on adopting the first normative content, which is standards jargon, standards lingo for standards that we won't change anymore. Whereas a lot of FHIR is still, we're still testing it and making sure it's right, and we'll change it if we think it's wrong. We've talked about doing a release 5 in late 2021 or 2022, which is the next version to fill out and make it like a pretty standard, a full standard, because at the moment we're still learning. But coronavirus has thrown a spoke into all of our plans, and we don't really know exactly when that's going to happen. HL7 is getting used to not meeting physically, and we've been doing that for a long time, meeting physically. So we'll see how that goes. So key to understanding the spec is in some kind of fantasy world, we could publish a standard, we could argue about how it was going to be, and then we could publish it and we would get it right the first time. So it would always be correct. But that's not the world that we live in. We've got to find the least worst compromise between all the different implementers who want something slightly different. And what we do, the way we do it is to iterate, to try things out, to learn from experience, to adjust, to repair. And then over time, you see the product, the content of the standard go through a maturity process. So initially it starts at level 0. Somebody thought it would be a good idea to post it and look at it. We could take it out. We could change our minds. We don't have any idea. Someone's just proposed it. And then it goes through a series of tests as more people test it and use it, and we have more experience with it, and it's got these gates to go through the maturity process. And as it goes through the process, change starts to get slower and less likely and harder, and then eventually it becomes impossible. And we have some content now that's gone through the entire cycle, where other content we've just added it recently. For instance, in the current version of the FHIR spec, we're adding some resources to make it possible to interoperate around evidence-based medicine, around taking research, describing the outcomes of the research in a computable way, and then sharing them, and then linking actual decisions made in practice to evidence-based medicine. Nobody's done that stuff before. It's not even something that doctors ever wrote down. And so it's a very immature idea. We have to go through a lot of work to get that to the point where we look at it and say, oh, right, we do know what we're doing. So every part of the FHIR specification's labeled to say where we are in the process. Some of it's normative, and otherwise you pay attention to the maturity level. So that's the overall standard. Tell you a little bit about our overall perspective of progress. We set out to do 3 things. We set out to disrupt healthcare IT standards. We want them to be more open, more responsive to the community, to have a modern approach, both how they were created and their technology, and that's pretty much happened. Even the standards, the other healthcare standards, everybody's set up and take notice of what we're doing, and they're turning their own standards to become more open, more responsive, more modern. That's great. That's good. It's good for everybody. So I'm really happy with that, and that process pretty much completed. It's still playing out, but it's going to. We said we wanted to disrupt healthcare IT, and that was, we wanted to make interoperability a way of life in healthcare IT, just normal, not something you bolt on afterwards and people are always unhappy with. We wanted to make it just the way things are. And we wanted to work towards person-centered record keeping instead of institutionally centered record keeping. And because that's what happens right now. The institution buys the record software, it keeps the record, it keeps the record for itself, it doesn't keep the record for the practitioners, the providers, the doctors and the nurses, and it doesn't keep it for the patient or the patient's family. And I'm like, that's stupid. We should be keeping our records in the way that work for the providers of healthcare as individuals and for the patients, not for the institutions. This is something that's starting to happen slowly. It's in progress. We've seen significant changes, but they certainly haven't landed yet. They're still in progress. And then we wanted to disrupt healthcare itself. I want healthcare that's seamless. We want it to be so that you can move your care from team to team to team, from institution to home, from home to a retirement home. We want that to happen without changes to the care. And yet everybody I know everywhere in the world, and I've got friends from India who tell me it's the same in India, there's gaps in the system and people fall into those gaps and they get sicker or they die. But as yet, we're only just beginning to disrupt healthcare. And of course, lots of other things have to change. Now, when I was a little kid, I had this book called Scuffy the Tugboat. Now, I don't know if this is a thing in India. It's massive. It was a big deal, this book, for little kids in Australia and when I was a little kid. So probably none of you have ever met it. But the story is that little Scuffy the Tugboat is a toy tugboat, belongs to the little boy with a purple top. And one day the little boy decides that instead of Scuffy sitting in the bath at home, he should have a go in a stream. So his father takes him to the top of a little stream, and he puts a tugboat in the stream. And the tugboat gets away from them and starts going down the stream, and it gradually grows into a little brook and then a faster river, and it sees all the life around the river, and then eventually it gets to the bottom of the river, and it's in the massive dock with these huge ships, and he heads off into the sea, and at the last minute he gets rescued out of the sea by the little boy. But a standard is like that. It starts at the very top and a little brook, and that's how the standards develops. But over time, you go down the stream, you get a bigger and bigger community, you move slower and slower, but you become more and more irresistible, and it's harder and harder to get anything done because there's this enormous inertia around you. And that's FHIR is sort of midway through that process. And standards like version 2, they're at the bottom of that process, running out into the sea, and everybody's starting to say, well, the river's going to fill up now with FHIR. But it's a good way to understand the overall process that we've turned into a massive project. And part of getting and understanding how should you take FHIR forward is to understand the problem, because a lot of people misunderstand the problem. So I got 3 laws of interoperability that try and get at the heart of what the problem is. And the first rule is that interoperability is all about the people. I remember when we started, it was all about the technology. We were trying to get machines to talk to each other. We're talking, we were trying to figure out how to get bytes from one place to another. But now the bytes move. It's not a technical problem at all. We can get traffic from one computer to another. It's really easy. What's hard is to get people to agree with each other about what it means. And so interoperability is all about people. And it follows then that people have to agree on what they're doing, and you need the right kind of people. And there's this kind of spectrum of people where you've got people at one end, they're political, social people. They're very good at getting on with each other, but they're not very good at paying attention to fine detail. Now, you've got other people who, there's all sorts of words for them because they're unpopular with the social people, who are technical, who pay attention to detail and very insistent that the detail be correct, but not actually very good at talking to each other. You need to get interoperability right. You need people in the middle of the process. Everybody's got a value to the process, but you need people who are social and technical. And you got to find those people. The second law of interoperability is you can hide the complexity, because there is complexity in what we do. You can hide it, or you can make it worse, but you can't make it go away. And the best way to hide it for most people is to make it someone else's problem. And we have complexity from everywhere. There's inherent complexity in the problem of healthcare. The biological system is really complicated. The way we describe it adds to the complexity. There's hundreds of years of experience with this. We have lots of business variability between countries, between different ways of thinking about medicine, between different age, like neonatal care or aged care. And then there's all of the stuff we added to it with incompetence and inappropriate solutions that have grown up over the years and we don't know how to deal with now. All those add to the complexity of what we're dealing with. There's no central authority that can bring that to heel. This happens a lot at HL7. We say, well, how would we solve this problem? We go, well, we should get everybody to treat patients the same way. Well, that's never going to happen. And the use cases are fractal. It depends how you look at them as to where you move complexity. And something that looks exactly the same kind of problem to one person looks like totally different problems to other people. The most dangerous thing you can do, and yet everybody does it, is to make your complexity someone else's problem. Your boss loves this because you've said it's easy. We finished, it's all ready to go, it's nice and simple. Somebody else is going to deal with the problems that you just pushed off the shelf. And actually the consequence of that is that there's a lot of confusion out there about the actual problem. So you can hide the complexity and make it worse, but you can't make it go away. It's going to exist somewhere. You need to be aware of that. And my third rule is cheap, flexible, and interoperable. When developing healthcare software, you're going to have 2 of these. You can't have 3. Yeah, it's very easy to produce a cheap and flexible system, but nobody knows what the data really is, and it's actually really expensive to make it interoperate. Or you can have a flexible and interoperable system, but it's going to be very expensive because it's a massive investment. Or you can have a cheap and interoperable system, but nobody can do anything with it because it's not flexible. You can't have all 3, and yet that's what everybody wants, to have all 3 of those. And of course, quite often when I present this rule, people say to me, well, you think you can have 2 of those? Yeah, I can't even get 2 of them. I can only get 1 at best. And that's a good point. But you can't have everything. Interoperability has a price. And part of that price is because of the way the process works. So after a lot of experience with doing healthcare standards, we've basically got to a point where there's 3 legs of the process. The first leg of the journey, HL7 or SNOMED or LOINC or others produce a platform standard. It does all sorts of stuff. It's a technology that we can use to solve healthcare problems, but everybody uses it for slightly different problems. There's the way it gets used in USA. There's the way it gets used in Australia, where I am. There's the way it gets used in Vietnam. There's the way it gets used in India. What we can put in the base platform standard is what all countries agree to. What we can put, but then each country has its own way of using it, its own agreements. And so the second phase is to take the platform standard and say, okay, this is how we use it in this context, whether that's a country or a vendor or a particular hospital, and that's adapting it to a particular community of use. And there's a bunch of organizations like IHE who do exactly that. And we even have because it's such a big deal, we have a set of expectations for how you should do that called the FHIR community process, which I won't talk about anymore. And then, having got agreement about how you're going to use it in a particular place and tested it, then you've got to drive it into production to actually make it happen in the market. It's actually the hardest part. And regulation, government, vendor consortiums, professional societies, that's where you actually drive the solutions into the market. HL7 is responsible for the first step, and we help other organizations with the second step, but HL7 doesn't have any influence over the third. That's pretty much the way it works around the world. But HL7 collaborates extensively with the governments, which actually that's what they want to do, is drive things into production. So I just wanted to emphasize the importance of you building a community of an open license and open engagements, open trademarks that anybody can take use of it. You really written permission, but you still can use it. And you need a strong process that can heal itself when it's broken. You need to be transparent, and you need to have good record keeping. These six things are the pillars of what we do so that people can trust us. Because what happens is companies, governments, universities, consultants, individuals, they bring it to HL7 and to the FHIR community. They bring their very best people, their very best ideas, and they give them to us. And why do they do that? Why don't they sell them? Now, of course, they want to sell things or use things, but if they bring their best platform ideas to us, they know that everybody can have them, and so they can sell product to a community where everybody has what they need to sell their product. But if they're only going to give those things to us to look after, if they can trust us that we're going to be good, reliable care custodians of what they give us. And it's these open, transparent processes that give them the confidence. And by doing that, what we actually produce is treasure that everybody owns. Everybody owns it, not any particular person owns it. It's public domain that we look after. So everybody owns it. And because everybody owns it, everybody is richer because everybody owns it. Everybody is better off. So that's a little bit about the underlying problems. Okay. So what do I think that means for India? So I had the pleasure of visiting India early last year. Yes, it was. It was earlier last year, in March last year. I met with a number of engineers and standards people, some of whom I see on the call today. I met with a few government ministers and so forth. But I was only there for 2 days, so I only have 2 days worth of perspective. So keep in mind that the perspective I'm talking about here is driven by my experience in many different countries, but not by a lot of experience in India. And I don't want to assume too much about how things are in India. So just keep that in mind. But I think that India, like a lot of countries, stands on a precipice. I actually got this photo in Chile last year. It's south from Santiago, I believe. We all stand where we can make a choice. We have this huge vista, this fantasy in front of us of a world that we can build, but we could accidentally fall off. And what will differentiate a happy future from a sad future is if we can work together as a community. So for me, the focus for every country in the world is building a resilient, robust, open community to support FHIR and to support healthcare interoperability within countries. Some countries are really well positioned to do this in some ways, and some are not. So what we would like is I'm just wondering whether I should try and mute somebody here. Except that I can. All right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
You might have to unmute yourself, Graham. We cannot hear you at this point. Thank you.
Hey Graham, can you unmute yourself? We can't hear you.
Hi Kumar, can you unmute Graham, please?
All right, so I had to stop sharing my screen in order to find the microphone so I could unmute myself. That was pretty clever, wasn't it? All right, so we're back again. Sorry about that. Okay, so back to India then. So the focus for going forwards is to build a community. The community should be passionate about building solutions for healthcare for India. It should be open and transparent, and that's really important. It needs a range of skills. It needs technical people, analytical people. It needs business and politics in the picture. That because what we do is at the fusion of all of those things, technology and healthcare and politics. The community needs to have a strong web presence. That's good social media representation and web advertising and so forth. It needs to hold FHIR-based events like this one. It needs to provide technical advice for anybody who's needing advice around how to use FHIR in a particular context in India. It should build implementation guides. I'll come back to those in a second. It needs to connect people. It needs to be well connected to people, and it connects India as well to the wider FHIR community internationally. When I look around the world and think about how different countries are going in terms of the process of adopting FHIR and using the web to change healthcare, those are the things that I ask myself about the community in the particular country. Does it have those features? And quite often people will write to me directly from anywhere in the world, and I'll talk to them and find out what it is they want and how's it going. Probably I get 10 emails or so a day on average from people somewhere in the world looking for help. And so then I refer them to their local FHIR affiliate or FHIR community if there is one, and very often they'll come back to me if they don't think they got what they wanted. And so those are the things that I'm looking for when I'm looking for what is a successful community. And in order to build a community like that, you need a common concept of us, who we are. And that's the basis that you have for building a shared sacrifice. Because using standards is actually a sacrifice. This bit, a lot of people are confused about this bit. Obviously, it's better to use a standard. And it is. It's much better to use a standard, but it's better in the long term. The more you use a standard, the more reward you get for using a standard. But when you first start using the standard, it's actually costs you more to do a particular task than if you didn't use a standard. Long term, it costs you a lot less, but short term, it costs you more. And so using standards very often is a sacrifice for somebody in the short term. And how do you make them take that sacrifice? How do you make them actually start using a standard? The benefits are clear long term, but it's hard for people to think long term. And the key part of that is who we are, a concept of who we are. And then the size of your shared interest drives the size of your sacrifice. But leadership matters to create that community, to make that concept of us real, and you need a uniting story. One thing I found as I travel around the world is the story that you need is very culture specific. Obviously, in a country like USA, which is hopelessly money focused, you got to have a story around money, but you also need a story about the Wild West and about bucking the system and about being your own person. That story doesn't work outside USA. There's a different story here in Australia, but my experience is that every country has its own culture and legends that talk about how and why you would gather together as a community to make healthcare better. It seems to me from what little I know about India, that there's a story around self-sacrifice and denial of short-term outcomes to chase the bigger picture. To me, that's a logical perspective for India based on your last 100 years of history. But it's not my story that matters or my interpretation that matters. It's your story. But what is your story that drives intelligent long-term outcomes? But it's the community says we are here to make healthcare better in India. And then what the community does is it goes through this psychologist called Tuckman who described how groups form. They form and then they storm as they figure out what they're about, and then they start figuring about how they're going to do what they're trying to do as a group, and they come up with norms for their behavior, and then they start asking people to conform to those norms so that the group can achieve whatever it is, whatever it's trying to achieve in the way that it's chosen to achieve it. And we have a process around group development like this. And the process roughly goes like somebody proposes a project. It's on social media, sometimes in person. Very often they do a bit of politics around that. And then we agree that it's something we're going to work on, a community of some kind. And then a small group of usually engineers with some clinical people and business people start iterating on what a solution looks like. As at the same time, you need political cover. This is something we're going to do. We're letting people figure out how it's going to happen, but we've agreed what's going to happen, and that has political blessing. And that small group produces a secretariat, a very small number of people whose job is to moderate the discussion, keep it going, keep records, write test case, write records about what's been agreed. And then those records, they start out as social media statements, and you need some kind of wiki or document or something. They gradually head towards formal specifications as more people get involved. And you go through that process and you let that process bubble away, more people get involved, the political cover drives people to say, yeah, this is going to happen, this is important. And over time, the process goes through that river again. It gets more and more formal. And what we like to see come out the other end of that process is a formal implementation guide, a formal computable statement of agreements. It's published as a website, but it comes with a bunch of technical resources that allow for computer-generated software for formal validation, for formal testing. And once you've got to that point and you start putting formal change control processes in, maybe a formal standards process on behalf of a particular country or whatever, and you start rolling out milestones, iterating the behavior. That's a very reproducible process around the world for the FHIR community now. And pretty much every country that's using FHIR has either formally or informally, and it becomes more formal as you go through the process, a national base specification, which is going through this process and becoming more formal. Whoops. And you pretty much need one of those in India, an Indian-based specification which applies to all use of FHIR in India, talks about how to do government identifiers, Indian billing and claiming and so forth, and then there's a national thing that applies in all uses, and then you would have specific projects for particular kinds of exchange or billing or making data available to the patient or whatever. And one thing that's important to understand about this process is writing standards is a really interesting challenge because people want a set of rules to tell people how to behave, and they also want a set of rules that let them innovate, let them be different. So how does it that rules let you be different? And the key is that what you do is you give up flexibility and variability at one level so that you can build flexibility and innovation at another level. So for instance, the easiest way to illustrate this was with rail gauges. Initially, everybody had different rail gauges for different railway lines, like between different cities, and they didn't want to give up the flexibility of having different railway lines, sizes, the gap between the two rails. But when you give up the gap between two rails, it becomes easier to innovate with the rolling stock because everybody's using the same rail gauge. And so you can actually innovate with the service or the stock or whatever that you provide. Sometimes really hard to tell with the standard which is going to work and create innovation and which is going to stop innovation. But one thing that I've learned is that the process works like these slinky dogs. So these are really popular toys in the USA and Europe and Australia for kids. So I don't know if you have them in India, but the front and the back can move independently, but the further apart they get from each other, the bigger problem you have, and eventually something's going to snap or break. And this is what happens with the government as well. So obviously the government wants to drive progress. The government wants to make sure progress is going in the right direction. I've seen this in lots of countries. And so the government sets policy. Great, that's what the government's for. The government drives and purchases. That's good. But to actually get a standard that works, you actually have to go through the technical process of figuring out what works. How are we going to do this? And that how are we going to do this is actually really hard to get it right, to make the right compromises. There's millions of decisions to make. And it's really hard for a government to make those decisions. The process the governments use, hierarchical and controlled, doesn't lead to good decisions at that level. So what I say around the world, and different countries struggle with different parts of this, is that there's a logical partnership here. The government, the national government, the regional government absolutely sets direction, chooses what we're going to do, but it should outsource, it should give to the non-government organization, the FHIR community in whatever form it takes. It should say to it, okay, you choose how to do what we want to do. And it actually lets the argument about how that can be done happen in a place that's not political, that won't come back. But it needs guidance. The community can't go off and do something different. But the government can't ask the community to do something they can't do. So it's like the front and the back of the dog. They need to work together, and they can go in different directions for a while, but they still need to be, in the end, come together. And so it's really important that the FHIR community is well connected politically so that it knows it can say to the government, this is what we can do, this is what we can't do, and the government says, this is what we want to do, how do we do it? So the most important thing for the community to do is to build capacity. Capacity to make decisions that are good decisions. Capacity to tell the truth about what's possible and what's not. And you've got to do that with, you've got to be sensitive about that, but you've got to do it. You've got to have the capacity to educate developers and analysts and documentation so that you have a community that can actually solve the problem. So I pointed out in the beginning, you got a huge community of developers here that know how to do things, but you need to actually turn that into a community that can solve problems in India. It needs to have the capacity to connect companies and governments and companies and each other to actually try solutions out. And that creates the capacity to turn policy into reality. And that capacity is the public treasure of healthcare development in India. As I said, you have to publish technical specifications. They support regional, national policies. They underwrite consistent interoperability. It's really important to follow the FHIR process to build those, but HL7 India has the right, as far as HL7 is concerned, to work with the national governments and national standards processes to publish the national specification for how India is used, how FHIR is used in India. Another thing that you should do, that community should do, is to provide migration collateral. You provide assistance for people who are migrating from existing approaches, such as version 2 and CDN XDS. I don't know if I've ever heard of them being used in India, but certainly version 2 I know about. So the international community provides a bunch of frameworks and general advice for how to use, so in this particular case, V2. So these are some of the work we've done in version 2 to FHIR conversion, which you're welcome to use. But because every country uses version 2 differently and has different regulations and culture and language and so forth, what you do is you actually need to take those things and turn them into real advice for India that people can actually use. There's a market opportunity here for people or communities or companies to provide services that help here. And even to do so as open source support libraries and so forth to make it easier and quicker to achieve what's profitable. I'm going to hurry through this because time's slipped away a bit, but around the world, we have huge adoption of FHIR in USA through Argonaut, which is the EHR vendor collaboration. And they've just published a bunch of rules to say that release 4 is going to be the basis of the next iteration. Have lots of use in the payment side in HL7, in USA, and lots of government projects. I'll give you these guys all these slides so you can go through these slower, but we have Apple, of course, lots of other personal health projects, lots of data analytics projects. In Europe, Europe is working on the International Patient Summary. India should have a good close look at the International Patient Summary. We'll be pushing along on that the next few weeks. I won't talk about Netherlands or Finland or England. I did want to talk about this. This might be something that's pretty useful for India. In Switzerland, they have a repository, which is a repository where anybody can go and create a personal healthcare account on the server, which is a FHIR server, and then they can share their data to researchers, and they can even get paid for doing that. A farmer buys their record off them directly off the server. And then in Switzerland, they actually created a coronavirus app, which the idea is everybody in the country can get the app and create an account on the server, and then they can start recording their symptoms, and then it's sort of population level surveillance of how individuals are going. That's what they're doing in Switzerland. I want to talk about Australia. So I will just quickly summarize that by saying we're in the phase of rapid growth around the world, and I've been watching the exponential growth of the virus, wondering whether we're also growing exponentially, but there's a lot of diverse approaches to how it's working around the world. I want to finish by talking about clinical processes. I said we wanted to change healthcare. Clinical processes are broken on organizational boundaries. We need to change that to create person-focused processes, either staff or patients. And to do that, we need cross-enterprise integrated workflows built on APIs. Yeah, you need the technology, you need the information management, you need that stuff sorted, but it requires fundamentally cultural change and community involvement to drive that, to create services that empower the patient and the staff, and to solve the problems that patients have. But to do that, you need to create public treasure. So join us creating public treasure. you need to join actually some open community. Where, I encourage all of you to be part of FHIR community in India. But remember, FHIR is not a solution to anything in itself. We need to build things on top of that to turn FHIR into solutions for India. But whatever you do, you need good governance, good transparency, good open practices. Thank you for listening, and I hope that things are going well. I'm happy to take questions if we want to do that. And I said I would come back a bit later. If you have technical questions you want to ask, you can batch them up and I'll take them later.
Thank you, Grahame. We can take a couple of questions if you have time.
Sure, I can do that.
Okay.
Are you planning to share the presentation?
Yeah, I will send them to you, Kumar, and
Yeah,
you can
I'll do that.
distribute them.
Sure.
So there was
So,
one slide where you showed the two URLs, my data, and there was one more, Switzerland, right?
Yeah, I will. I'll send it to Kumar now, and he can distribute it. You can get the URLs from
I have a
that.
question on the Switzerland one. Is it possible for you to show the slide, please? One was my data. There was one more, right? Switzerland one.
can we
Yeah.
do it in the
Very
afternoon?
fast. It went
If
very
that's
fast on
okay.
the Switzerland one.
Bhagwan, can we do it in the afternoon? If that's possible. That's not urgent.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Bharat Gera, you had a question. Can you go ahead, please?
Yeah, hi, that was a great talk, Graham. I just had one question. India has been using the UPI-based mechanism for financial transactions, and done it very successfully. And now it's proposing to do the same thing for healthcare interoperability. Where does FHIR fit in this model?
In terms of financial transactions to support healthcare?
No. We're using the same model that was used for financial transactions. Now the same mechanism and the same group of people are getting down to create interoperability in healthcare. I don't know if you heard about the SWAST initiative, which is planned along the same initiative, same architectural approach as the financial applications that we use for a unified payments interface.
So I don't know enough about UPI to comment specifically. I've heard about it once before, but I can't say. But the characteristics of the payment space is that the data is really simple, and it's very discrete and well described, and you have very large amounts of data with very well understood business processes. Whereas the characteristics of healthcare are very messy data, very poor quality data, very poorly described business processes. My experience is that people who come to healthcare from outside healthcare, assuming that they know interoperability, are good at the things that don't matter that much because they're used to a much better described business environment, much better described information. And I've seen them again and again get frustrated and fail because of that. And that doesn't always happen. But there's a whole bunch of features of FHIR that are built around our experience of how things work in healthcare. But other than that, I can't comment specifically about UPI, and maybe they won't, or maybe they will have those problems. But I would think it would be wise for India to pay attention to what other countries are doing in healthcare because of the characteristics of healthcare. That's all I can say.
Thank you, Grahame.
Thank you.
So it's 10:02. It's 10:02. I'll call upon Manik Rajendran. He has an announcement to make. Please, Manik.
Just a minute. Are you all able to see me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you, Graham. That was
Pleasure.
a riveting talk, to say the least. And
Thanks.
you,
But I do need to say now, to even interrupt for a second, someone's pointed out by email that I had the flag wrong. I'm really sorry about that. I didn't pay enough attention. So I apologize for not getting the flag right.
all right. Thank you. Yes. Well, there was also another point that one of our participants pointed out in when you were talking about build a community, range of skills. You had specified technical, analytical, business, political. We need to include clinical also there.
Business, clinical, yes, same thing.
Yes.
But yes,
It's taken
definitely
for granted.
clinical.
Yes, taken for granted. But thank you for that beautiful couple of slides that you have shown. In fact, all of them are golden. A couple of them are very specific to what we are doing in one of the tracks. We have 5 tracks. One of the track is what we call COVID-19 teleconsultation. It is very relevant at this point in India when the cases are rising. We do not have enough doctors, or we do not have enough facilities, or we do not have enough doctors in the facilities. So telecommunication is where it's all going to happen. It's happening, but it's all happening haphazardly. We have maybe 300, 400 telemedicine platform companies that are out there. And we also have a number of governments and departments that are coming up with helping the public directly, and they are unable to match these two people. We have millions of people that want one consult with a doctor just to say, okay, I got fever, I got chills, what do I do? A simple consult based on a simple constitutional symptoms review would do the trick. People do not need to flock to the hospitals unnecessarily. They could be taken care of at home. They could self-isolate at home. To make all of this happen, we need these two entities to come together. And that's what that particular COVID-19 teleconsultation track is all about. And you had actually talked about how to build a community, open, transparent, passionate about building. And we have about 25 such people in that particular track. And we had a very good session yesterday between 5 p.m. to about 7:30 p.m. And we had already started constructing certain aspects of what we want to show. And so we are throwing open a challenge to everyone here today, everyone that would attend the other sessions in the other track, and people who already have picked up some of the skills that you have talked about, to come together, come over, pick up a host. Every one of the people in the track is a host. They know the problem very well. They've been discussing that very well, and they will all start to build the solution for the particular issue of matching these two with a web portal, with a web app, and showcase it to us tomorrow. And we would love to have you review the solutions. So within about 24 hours, we would have built an entire community of interested people who are open and transparent and donating to the cause of building something very quickly. And I invite everyone, anyone who's interested to come in, and we will open up for a more detailed discussion of the exact problem and the exact solution we are seeking.
I look forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Manik. Thank you, Graham. Thanks for the talk. If you have time, and if you want, you may stay back for some questions,
Sure,
or else you can come in the afternoon.
I'll do both.
Okay.
I can stay here for a little while and I'll come back later.
So Graham is still on. If you have any questions.
Kumar, may I go next? Hello, Kumar. Hi, am I audible?
Sure.
Right.
I'll stop the recording.
Thanks. Thanks. Graham, just a quick thing, please. You know,
all right. So the floor
actually...
is open now. Please go ahead with your questions. To type the questions so that I can read out.